Welcome to Champions Network TV, where we discuss important issues, things that happen across the globe and in Africa. And today, just sit back. If you have got a cup of coffee, have a cup of coffee, and anything to drink. Feel free to ask any questions if you want to. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the notification bell so that you don't miss when we have programs like this coming up. Today, we are honored. Uh, it's a broadcast where we are meeting the leaders. We have got Mr. Makabayi in the house. I'll just talk a little bit about him. He is not just an official, he is a system architect for democracy. So at some point, he was a returning officer for Kampala. He will tell us what it means, the capital city of Uganda, and the supervisor of voter data. He handles one of the highest pressure jobs in the country. And today, we will learn how he manages this role and sometimes the crisis, and how does he maintain public trust. So, Mr. Makabayi,
Yes,
welcome.
thank you very much.
Welcome to Champion Network
Reza.
TV.
Thank you.
And to start off, most people see the ballot box, but they don't see the years of preparation before a single vote is cast. How did your journey lead you to the Electoral Commission, and what keeps you passionate about the work for over 23 years?
My journey to the Electoral Commission. Good evening, our viewers and listeners. My name is Henry Makabayi. I work for the Electoral Commission of Uganda. This is not to suggest that I'm speaking on behalf of it. I'm giving my own views about my experience in election management. And as you may be aware, Uganda is really in the final stages of organizing a general election, which will be about a month from now. That's on the 15th of January 2026. My journey to the Electoral Commission, I never knew that I would ever work in elections. I studied business administration and practiced in that field for a while. But then my first interaction with elections was in the year 2001, where a friend just called me when I was on my way home and said, you know, Henry, there is a discussion that's going to be on Radio 1. There's a radio in Uganda called Radio 1. And they were going to discuss elections which had just been conducted. At that time, I was working in a private coffee export company. So I had nothing to do with elections. So I presented myself, I went and discussed, and I remember there had been some challenges in that election, whereby some election materials meant for one region had been delivered to another region. And of course, some political actors were really castigating that. And I innocently put myself in the shoes of those election practitioners. And had to defend them when I did not even know the circumstances under which they were operating. I had to acknowledge that to err is human, but that the error that had occurred had been rectified in good time for the people to go to election, to elect. And then later on that year, I get again invited to go and work on a part-time basis. There had been challenges with the voters register, and I had been working with computers and databases from 1990. My first job actually was the job of a computer operator at a time when there were not many computers in Uganda. So I joined the team that tried to work on the register. That time, the Electoral Commission of Uganda was transiting from a manual voters register to a digital one in the sense that now they had a database and then photographs, a photographic voters register had been originated and then it needed to be put right. I worked there for a short while. Then I went into collecting taxes. I'm giving you how I've been juggling in this. And when I went to the Uganda Revenue Authority, I did not know that I would get back to the Electoral Commission. I went to the Uganda Revenue Authority for 1.5 years, and then I moved on to the Electoral Commission, where I thought my working career had been such that my first job had been for 4 years, my second job had been for 4 years, the next job had been for 1 year, and I had thought maybe I wouldn't even take more than 4 years at the Electoral Commission, but here I am. I've spent 22 years, and I've gone through, I've experienced the conduct of an election referendum, which had to do with the transition from the movement electoral system that Uganda had at the time, that was in 2005, and the transition to multi-party democracy, which our country is practicing to date. And as of now, actually, there are more than 28 political parties in Uganda. And of those, 8 of them have fielded candidates for the presidential election, which will be held on 15th of January. And that is a bit of my journey to elections. And one thing I should say from the onset is that elections are not an event. Many people look at elections as what takes place on election day. Elections are a process, and in the elections world, we refer to an electoral cycle. That if one is to effectively participate in elections, they should effectively participate in the entire cycle. To the extent that if an election observer is to give an objective view of a given election, they would need to understand what happens in the 3 general phases of the electoral cycle: the pre-election period, where preparations are done, where electoral reforms are carried out, the planning, the budgeting, purchasing of equipment, and name it. And then the election period, where mainly polling activities occur. And then we have the post-election period, where evaluations are done, lessons are taken from the experiences that would have been encountered, lessons would be taken from other election practitioners, what worked well for others that you could integrate into your electoral system. So briefly, that's my brief journey. So my permanent working with the Electoral Commission started in 2003, and as of now, I've made I'm approaching the 23rd year in election management.
Okay. Thank you very much for such an, long journey and where you're coming from the technical then into the electrical. So you've moved from the technical data roles to being a returning officer in the heart of Kampala. What is the biggest mindset shift you had to make when moving from managing computers to managing people and the politicians?
Thank you very much, Mr. Mahiza. Uh, Ordinarily, what I would encourage any election management body is to train and cultivate all-round election officials such that a person who has been in administration, who has been in finance, has a feeling of what it means to manage elections. Now, our orientation into the election world started with us. It was a good coincidence that we were recruited at a time when there were by-elections. And we started off our practicals as being presiding officers, and that's the person who is managing a polling station, whereby you are organizing the layout of a polling station and issuing ballots, then counting them at the end of the day, and then filling the required forms, submitting those returns to a returning officer who does a compilation of the results to ultimately declare. Now, what I was saying is that it's very good for an election officer to be an all-rounder, and that's what helped me to manage the usual data roles where I essentially interact with computers, papers, photographs, and name it, and hardly with other people, other stakeholders. But then, as a returning officer, yeah, you are aware of my being a returning officer in Kampala, and that was from October last year up to 18th June this year. But I had been a returning officer before in the general election of 2016. I was the returning officer for the local government elections in an electoral district called Kayunga, which is just about 60 kilometers from Kampala. And that situation arose from a challenge where there had been, I would expressly put it, there had been election violence where a returning officer had been assaulted, and she expressed fears about continuing with that role in that electoral cycle. So my employer, I don't know what they based on, they decided that I would be the one to go and face that situation. And by God's grace, I should say, I handled the local government at sub-county level elections. Um, there was no violence, and there was even no petition, meaning that election was handled satisfactorily, to the best of my knowledge. My employers are entitled to their opinion about what it was. And then in 2018, 21, again, even when I was away on official duty, when I came back after the presidential election, the following day I was given a letter to still assigning me to the same district for the same local council at sub-county level elections, because the returning officer, again, another one, had been faced, had faced the same challenges that the previous, that had arisen in the previous election. So with that, definitely I was hesitant to go, but where duty calls, you must go and face a situation. Again, I had to go back to Kayunga district. That's working as a returning officer for the second time. And we went through that election. It was very heated, a lot of exchange of hot words with stakeholders who wanted things done their way, and yet things had to be done the right way. And the will of the voters needed to prevail. And I did ensure that the will of the voters prevailed. Of course, to the dissatisfaction of some of the stakeholders, some of whom had been the orchestrators of the violence that had been meted out to my predecessors. But fortunately, I did not experience that violence, even when we had hot exchanges with some of the stakeholders. But at least they got to understand that I was doing my part. They had done their part of canvassing for votes, and the voters had decided, and I had brought out the verdict of the voters. Now, Kampala is the most recent, and that was really my hottest experience as a returning officer. One, there had been some challenges in the administration of that district, and our employer had opted to recall the returning officer to head office, and then I was sent there. But that was really a temporary measure initially, because transfers were due. And when I assumed Kampala, it was a temporary measure. Then in the process, a member of parliament died, and a by-election had to be conducted, because we still had more than 6 months to a general election. Our laws require that if a seat in parliament falls vacant, it must be filled within 60 days for as long as it's more than 6 months to the general election. So that's how I end up being at the center of the conduct of that election. Well, we did our best, because I can't say I was alone. It was a team. We did our best. There were some challenges from some stakeholders, some traces of confrontation between some politicians and security. And then, unfortunately, on the election day, there were some skirmishes at the time of counting of votes, and some results were not brought to me as a returning officer. So that was a very challenging moment. It is a moment that initiated investigations by the state. They needed to understand why certain results had not arisen, had not been delivered. And then, of course, the result went in a certain direction, and one of the participants did not agree with the outcome of that result and petitioned court. And well, court ruled in favor of that petitioner. The one who was petitioned appealed. What I'm trying to put forward is that we have functional systems in our electoral system that when one disagrees with the outcome of an election, they have a remedy of going to courts of law. But it's very interesting to note that whereas I would have been the main defendant because I was a representative of my employer, the courts, when we went to court, the petitioners, in their wisdom, did not find any question to ask me in the courts of law. And for me, that really means they were satisfied with the evidence I had provided, but I was faulted for tallying results when I had not received others, and that those that had not been received, if they had all been polled for the runner-up would have won. And that is the ruling that the person who had won at that election, who had been declared winner and who was sworn in as member of parliament, that's a verdict that he petitioned. But for us as the Electoral Commission, we did not petition. We said, okay, if you say we did not secure the materials well, indeed, we did not receive the results, so they were not secure. But given the little means that we had of one constable, violent crowd. So definitely the Electoral Commission is now thinking of how best to manage such and be able to secure electoral materials so that a count can be done maybe later, or at least so that there is a good record, an accurate record of what will have transpired at the election. So those are the challenges of a returning officer. Now, the issue is that in elections, the main challenge, one of the challenges, I will not say the main because saying the main is relative, is that there is need to reconcile perceptions of the stakeholders and then the reality of the operating laws and the operating environment. And that's where most challenges seem to arise. So as election practitioners, we try our level best to clear certain perceptions that people may have, and then to reconcile them with the realities by bringing forth the stakeholders to understand what we go through in managing elections.
Thank you very much, well articulated. Someone listening might want to know, in just a brief, what's the role of a returning officer?
The role of a returning officer, in summary, is to manage elections in a gazetted electoral area. To start with, to be a returning officer, you must be gazetted in the National Gazette, and your electoral area is defined. In our case, in Uganda, I could say we have electoral districts. And then for the presidential election, we have the nation as an electoral area. So all electoral districts have returning officers and assistant returning officers. And then we also have the chairperson of the Electoral Commission as the returning officer of the presidential election.
Oh,
So
right.
Those roles vary, but they all center around organizing and presiding over an election and ultimately tabulating the results of an election and declaring the winner.
Okay.
And in our situation, the moment a declaration is done and somebody is dissatisfied with it, then the dissatisfied party has recourse to the courts of law, where then the returning officer has to go and defend the position of how they declared whoever they declared and to establish whether the declaration was in conformity with the laws, with the outcome of that election, and with the laws that governed that election. So the returning officer gets all recruits polling officials, people who will work on election day, people who work in other electoral activities. Because if I cite the Ugandan case and making reference to the electoral cycle that I talked about, that in the pre-electoral period, there are preparations we make. Then when we will go to the electoral period, we have issues like registration of voters. So the returning officer would have to appoint register update officers. We also have in the Ugandan situation display of that register, because for any register to be reliable, to be acceptable, it needs to have only those persons who are eligible to vote at an election. So, in the Ugandan case, we have what we call display of the National Voters Register. Even when we have by-elections, that register is displayed for people, the community, to help in cleaning that register. So this role is not for the Electoral Commission alone. To start with, the Electoral Commission, other than seeing names and images of persons on a register, we do not know those individuals. But the communities know those people better, and they are able to help in cleaning the register. So they will point out who does not belong to that area, who died, and so on and so forth. So that ultimately, those who should be on are included, those who shouldn't be there are removed. And then when it comes to other activities, of course, on election day, the returning officer will still appoint presiding officers and the assistants, the officials that will work on election day. And as a matter of fact, in the Ugandan situation, I think an advert is coming out tomorrow regarding recruitment of presiding officer, polling officials for the elections early next year. Then ultimately, uh, the returning officer also supervises other subordinate electoral officials. In the Ugandan situation, we have supervisors at parish and sub-county level, and all these work or are answerable to the returning officer. So that, to answer you, that's what a returning officer, especially in the Ugandan situation, does. And this is a similar role that returning officers in other jurisdictions in Africa perform.
Thank you very much. We will move a little away. We want your international role. I think you were at one point part of the observer missions for elections in Ghana.
I've been an observer in Ghana twice. Yeah.
Oh, twice. And can you maybe just in a nutshell to just compare and contrast the electoral system in Ghana and in Uganda, and what lessons did you learn as an electoral commission for Uganda whilst you were observing the Ghanaian elections?
Uh, I was an election observer in Ghana for the general elections of the year 2008. and 2012. And of course, I observed that in Ghana, for example, the, the Electoral Commission is very central in, in making proposals to the laws that govern elections in that country. At that time, the Electoral Commission had the powers to, one, to come up with its budget, and that budget was not subject to editing by any other authority, to the extent that for as long as, because of the consultative process they went through, if they were to require any resources and government did not have those resources, it was the duty of government to look for those resources elsewhere, but not to adjust the budget of the Electoral Commission. Our situation in Uganda is a bit different, that we operate within the resource envelope that the government has. And of course, the Ghana situation, my observation was that, yes, they had some donor funding for their elections. I think the United Nations program had a hand in financing some of their operations. But in the Ugandan situation, the elections are, I could say, 99.9% funded by the government of Uganda. Now, when it comes to organizing, one, the, the way Ghana operates the election is that their returning officers, I could say, are almost ad hoc, in that they would be appointed about 3 months to the election, and then they would continue for another few months after the election to handle the petitions bit. But in the Ugandan situation, ours are permanent staff, that you are appointed a returning officer, you are on a day-to-day, I mean, you are on the workforce, daily workforce of the Electoral Commission. Now, we learned about biometric verification, voter verification from the Ghana situation. In Ghana, they had a situation where they had come up and the political actors had agreed that if you are to be verified at the polling station, if the biometric equipment did not verify you positively, then you would not vote. At least that was for one of those elections. In the Ugandan situation, we have been having a situation where if the biometric equipment did not identify you positively, then there would be a manual bypass for as long as you appeared on the physical paper register that would be at the polling station. So you wouldn't be disenfranchised just because of that. Just to comment about this, that the verification is has been by way of fingerprints, and because fingerprints, the ridges can easily get worn out. We have situations of people like mechanics who are handling grease and oily stuff. We observe that they have a tendency of having their ridges worn out. If I got my biometrics, my fingerprints captured today, after about a year or 3 years when we are going to have an election, my fingerprints may be worn out and the biometric equipment may not read the fingerprint. So Uganda, this time round, has come up with an innovation. And the innovation is that fingerprints are not the only biometrics that can be verified. there was an effort to capture the iris, but we didn't have enough time for that. So the option that we've had to integrate into our biometric verification this time around is the photograph. That if your fingerprint cannot be verified, then your photograph will be taken. And then that photograph, the system in the biometric kit runs and matches it with your photograph on the register. And if you are positively identified, then you vote. If you are not, then you will not vote, because that would mean you do not belong to that polling station. So that was to save people whose fingerprints may not be recognized and yet they are genuinely registered. So that's what we are going to use this time around the 2026 general elections, and training regarding that, as a coincidence, starts tomorrow. So it's as if you knew what is happening in Uganda and decided to. So now, one other thing that we learned from the Ghana elections was that for them, people who are heavily involved on election day, these include election workers, these include health workers, then the security people who will be active on polling day. They are given an opportunity to vote in advance. Then their votes are counted together with those that will vote on the designated election day where everybody else votes. In the Ugandan situation, we are still grappling with that, where we do not yet have a law that provides for early voting for election workers and for other social workers who are busy on election day and may not have an opportunity to go to their polling stations to cast their votes. And then regarding timelines, uh, in Ghana, I think they have up to about 1 month within which to declare the winner of the election. But the Ugandan situation requires that a winner at any election or by-election should be declared within 48 hours of closure of the polls. So if there was an election that ended today, which is Sunday, by Tuesday, the winner ought to be declared.
Wow. This one is more technical. We are bringing you back to the to the technical field. We often say that data is the new oil, or in your role as supervising voter data management, how do you ensure that the oil, which is the data, voter data of our democracy, the voters register, remains pure and accurate? But I think we have mentioned quite a bit about it when you mentioned about involving the people within the constituencies to really. Okay, maybe you can go on. Maybe there may something that you might want to add on.
To like you said, this data needs to be pure, reliable, and for you to have a reliable, acceptable voters register, one, you need to follow the law regarding compiling that register. In the Ugandan situation, for one to qualify to appear on a particular voters register, they need to either originate or they need to be resident in that particular parish. The parish is the main unit of registration. Of course, besides being a citizen of the country of Uganda and being of age, that is being 18 and above. Now, in whatever we do, we try to follow that. I'll give you a case that the Ugandan situation is a very interesting one, that we have so many elective positions. We have direct elected members of parliament, we have women members of parliament representing districts, we have youth members of parliament, you have the army, Uganda People's Defense Forces that also elects. Now, all those registers have to be compiled and they should have the eligible persons. Definitely, you will not expect Makabayi, who is a civilian, to be part of the electorate of the Uganda People's Defense Forces that elects 10 members to represent them in parliament. So we use the respective groups. For example, if the elections are for youth, then the people on that register have to be between the ages of, from the age of 18 to the age of 30. If the election is of older persons, then that person should be, the persons there should be people who are more than 60 years. If the election is for persons with disabilities, then there should be evidence that the respective persons have a certain disability. And like I said again, if the election is for the People's Defense Forces, then one needs to be a member of that electoral college that elects them. So it's very important that the laws are respected regarding compilation of those registers. Then, two, periodically, there is need to subject this register to the scrutiny by the population, and then the relevant feedback is given regarding what is required to have that register cleaned and made up to date. So for it to be pure and accurate, one, the law needs to be complied with. Two, it should be subjected to checking and scrutiny by the stakeholders. And then three, whatever observations are made in that process of scrutiny are captured in order to be able to clean the register.
Earlier on, you mentioned about participating in the electoral cycles. How does the opposition stakeholders
Participate. Okay.
participate in these electoral cycles, and what activities will they be doing?
They participate by way of one, they avail the opportunity to field candidates. Now, in the Ugandan situation, we have a situation whereby whenever we have an activity, stakeholder engagement is at the forefront. And in stakeholder engagement, the principal people that we call are political parties, even the civil society organizations are invited. So the opposition part, the political parties, really, all of them are given an opportunity to participate in all these exercises. Like I was telling you, if we cite the case of presidential election, any political party that can mobilize the requisite signatures from a certain percentage of the country can field a candidate. Even independent persons can field candidates. So it's not only political parties, even independents who do not subscribe to respect to the existing parties have are given an opportunity to participate. Uh, the Electoral Commission, in the case of Uganda, got a political parties desk which coordinates the communication with the political parties, which receives their complaints, their suggestions, and then there is also a forum where political parties interact uh, and they meet regularly. And political parties in the Ugandan situation also are facilitated depending on their representation in parliament, facilitated by way of money. And that money is channeled through the Electoral Commission in Uganda. So political parties are not left out. Ever since we went to a multi-party system in the year 2005, of course, before that we had a movement electoral system whereby the focus was on individual merit, what qualities an individual had, then they would present themselves for election, and then all would operate under that system without differentiation of political parties. But that system was set aside when we had a referendum in the year 2005, and Ugandans decided to go to a multi-party setting.
This is for an aspiring tech leaders watching. How do you balance the need for a high tech security with the need for a system that is simple enough for a grandmother in a village to trust and understand?
Uh, Balancing between the interests and the knowledge of those that are tech savvy and those that were born before computers and may not have even seen computers is very important. Of course, technology is taking center stage in elections. Now, for people to appreciate these technologies, voter education is very essential, and efforts are always made by election management bodies to conduct voter education to make the voters and the general population. I'm saying the general population because there are certain people who opt not to be voters, but they are citizens and they have a stake in the country. So they also are entitled to be enlightened about how the electoral process are handled. So the technologies that we use, for example, in the Ugandan situation, are technologies that have to do with voter registration, where one has to present oneself and then they have to explain to you that, well, they are taking your photograph because that photograph will have to appear. They are taking your fingerprints because those fingerprints will also be essential to help in verifying whether you are the one when you are appearing at the polling station. So this voter education is very important. Of course, then other technologies come in to do with the results management. Of course, initially, simple spreadsheets can be used to capture results, but given our tight time frames in the Ugandan situation, whereby you have 146 districts, you have 343 constituencies spread all over the country, and yet results have to be declared within 48 hours. We need systems that really need to feed into each other. And in the Ugandan situation, since 2010, we've been operating, since 2011, we've been operating an electronic results transmission and dissemination system. And that's what a number of countries really endeavor to do. So that data entry is done at the grassroots, fed into a central server. You've talked about data security. That's where our attention is always drawn to. Of course, if you have an online system, you must really take the issue of data security seriously, and Uganda does not take that lightly. And a very interesting thing to note with the Ugandan elections is that whenever the results of the presidential candidate of the presidential elections have been declared, uh, they are published on the website per polling station, because the basic unit of election is a polling per polling station. We have done that in the past, and I think we will continue doing that. And that normally is intended for transparency, for one to establish whether the result that you knew, that you had at a polling station, is the one that has ended up being captured and being the basis for declaring who ultimately wins. Now, for people to develop confidence in that, at polling stations, we have agents that are permitted per candidate, and then the agents are given a copy of the results that have been declared or announced at a particular polling station, and they are at liberty to do their own additions to compare with those that the Electoral Commission ultimately. So the issue is transparency, allowing agents to be present, to witness, in order to have confidence in the prevailing system. So there are manual records like declaration of results forms that are available normally, that do not need one to know how to use a computer. But we also have electronic compilations that are periodically hosted on our websites after an election that people can continue referring to. So there are efforts to make everybody understand how the ultimate result has been arrived at, and that is done. And of course, those who end up disagreeing with that, like I said earlier, have the opportunity to prove their cases before courts of law, and then the courts of law will decide the course of action, where if the Electoral Commission will have been faulted, then that's it. Those are situations where you have by-elections being, in fact, we even have situations where courts have declared another person as the winner, that whereas this person was declared the winner, from the facts availed to court, we have established that so and so should have been the winner, and the court declares that person and withdraws the win of the one who may have been erroneously declared. But what is at the center of this is that there are always efforts by electoral management bodies to make sure that if there is any technology that is introduced, the gist of that technology, how it will work, and the benefits of it are normally passed on to the respective stakeholders. And among the stakeholders are political parties, and these political parties have the duty to pass on that message to their supporters. So it's not just a role of the electoral management body, but a role of the entire uh, population, the stakeholders, to ensure that everybody within the system of democracy of the country gets to understand whatever is used within that election.
Um, you have you have spoken about you being thrown in the deeper end at local government where there was issues,
Yeah.
and also being thrown in the deeper end of being the returning officer of Kampala, which is the
Mm.
capital seat and the hot seat. How do you remain calm under pressure in this ending such difficult circumstances?
One, what makes one firm to start with is abiding by the law. You will definitely, there will, in our situations, there will be political pressures from the participating parties. All the participating parties exert pressures. I mean, whoever goes to an election goes in with a view of winning. Of course, the challenge arises when they go in with the mindset of we either win or they lose. In other words, wanting to win and not even seeing that the alternative of losing is there. But it is very important that a returning officer who is a referee in this matter needs to be calm, because if you get emotional, you are bound to make mistakes. And I want the world to understand that mistakes of returning officers can be fatal. They have been fatal, and therefore being very calm, being law abiding in the sense that following the dictates of the law that you are applying to conduct that particular election, and then bringing out the results that depict the will of the population at that particular election is very important. Of course, one may make a mistake, but let that mistake be accidental and not a deliberate thing that causes trouble. Because you see, you will never know the magnitude of chaos that may arise out of a mistake that you commit. And you can only be, you ought to be conscious about the effects of your actions or your omissions. And the moment a returning officer is conscious about that, then you can manage to withstand whatever pressure that may arise. And the moment you are calm, then it instills confidence in the participants, to the extent that even the one who may be exerting unnecessary pressure will get to realize that, well, the truth is that this pressure that I'm exerting is not called for. But like you said, it's very important for one to be calm, guided by the law, and being conscious that the role of a returning officer has a bearing on the stability of a nation. And the moment one sees that what they have to do should be a contribution towards stability, then they should be able to do the right thing as returning officers. And then stakeholder engagement, for them to understand the laws and what a returning officer bases on to ultimately make, because to make the declarations that they do, The moment the stakeholders get to understand that, then their expectations or demands or pushes are then guided by that. So I've been in those, unfortunately, tight situations, trying to step in for a previous violent situation and handling, have handled elections and I brought, I mean, in a calm situation ultimately that has cooled situations that would have otherwise been volatile. What has guided me is one, you need to be firm. You need to know what is right and what is wrong, what is lawful and what is not lawful, and then understanding the ramifications, the implications of a mistake. And in the election world, it's very unfortunate for us is that it's not the expectation of society is 100% delivery. They don't expect us to make mistakes, whereas mistakes can be committed in certain sectors. But the moment an election officer knows that the level of expectation from society is very high, they need to be conscious and work towards that.
Yeah. I'm coming back to part of your work. You presented a paper at an a paper internationally on crisis management regarding elections during COVID-19. Um, what was the toughest decision you had to make during that period, and what did it teach you about crisis management?
One, that paper I remember was at the Association of World Electoral Bodies in the year 2020, and I had to make a presentation about how Uganda was prepared to handle elections in that crisis. One, that was a crisis that we had not come across in our lifetimes. It was sudden and it impacted different countries differently. Even some decisions were varying, some were looking extreme. Now, in the Ugandan situation, of course, there were those COVID standard operating procedures that were adopted worldwide, things like washing hands, keeping social distance, not having gatherings. Apparently, in Uganda in 2020, most of the campaigns were not by way of political rallies. They were mainly, there was a lot of use of the mass media, radios, and television, and then meeting small groups of people, not mass rallies. Of course, some political players felt they were disadvantaged, that they did not have access to the communities, but that was a dictate of the health situation that prevailed. And then during our elections, social distancing had to be maintained in the queues. You can imagine a polling station that is supposed to have, say, 1,000 voters, and efforts had to be made to ensure that we had to provide for facilities for washing hands for all the voters that were coming in, and washing hands and sanitizers. That was now one of the sanitizers became an election material, and then enforcing the use of masks, that had to be done, and the presiding officer had to ensure that whichever voter was coming before them They themselves, to start with, had to have masks, and indeed, all our offices were provided with masks to ensure that the officers used them, and then the voters had to use masks. And the government of Uganda had made efforts to provide reusable masks, cloth masks, which the users would wash and then apply again. So they were encouraged to wash, iron them, and then so the issue of masks and social distancing really helped in ensuring safety during the general elections. And those are some of the things that I shared during my presentation at at, a conference of the Association of World Election Bodies. Oh, yeah, and apparently it was also an online presentation. We did not meet physically. Made an online presentation regarding that.
Um, thank you very much. The, this is a network of champions, and we believe in raising the next generation of leaders. And what is the most important quality a young Ugandan needs if they want to save their country in a high stake public office like your one?
I think it will definitely not be one quality. It has to be a collection of qualities.
Mhm.
First and foremost is that one needs to understand the law and then be able to apply that law as the principal guiding principle. Then one needs the quality of communication and persuasion, that here you are, you have an electoral situation, you need to communicate what it entails and persuade those involved, those involved that what you are supposed to do is in conformity with the given law for it to gain acceptance. But three, I think one needs to be very conscious that in whatever you are doing, you should be mindful about the consequences of what you do. Because there is a tendency of some people having the I don't care attitude. Unfortunately, when you don't care, you are not caring is affecting other people who were not part of you are not caring. So it's very important to be conscious about the implications of what you do.
All
But
right.
above all, it's good to know that you are in a current regeneration and you need to make a contribution so that the future generation finds an ideal situation to also thrive, to live and thrive. So the issue of sustainability comes to play. So it's very important that our generation shares our experiences with the younger generation for them to be able to carry on from wherever we shall live. Because definitely, if it's a public office, there's a retirement age. So when you retire, then younger people definitely will have to come in. They also play their part, but they also need to learn from what those that were there before them did. And election management bodies, like any other body, need to be learning organizations. They should learn from their experiences that if you encountered such a challenge today, that should not be a challenge to you again in the subsequent. You should devise a means of handling that challenge so that you do not have to keep making the same mistake over and over.
Um, as you said, this is a network of champions. We just want to tap into your experience. Who is who is the either world leader or a leader within Uganda whom you have come across, either interacted with, who have shaped or changed the way you see the world or your worldview? Or you might have read about them in a book. I don't know what it is.
In the Ugandan situation, I must say, being a person who is working with elections, one person who has been very influential on the way I manage elections is our leader, President Yoweri Museveni, who is very passionate about free and fair elections. Because in any public speaking, in even smaller interactions with people, he emphasizes the fact that mishandling of elections is what caused him to go to fight the Obote regime. And he is passionate about free and fair elections. I told you about the issue of biometric voter verification equipment that we are going to use in the 2016 election. Some quarters have attempted to dissuade him not to have that verification done. And he has been insistent that there must be one man, one vote in Uganda. And very interesting measures have been proposed by him in an effort to avoid uh, malpractices in elections. One, every ballot that will be cast in the next general election is supposed to be scanned. As a matter of fact, ballot production is going on now, and the specifications are clear that they should have a code, a QR code, or a barcode that will be scanned. So when a person is being given a ballot, it will be scanned. And then when the counting is going to start, all the ballots that will have ended up in the ballot box will be scanned to prove that they had been authorized. So you asked me about a person who has had an effect, a positive effect on me regarding elections. And some of the confident stances I've taken in managing challenging elections have been due to the fact that I know that the head of state believes in fair, free elections to the extent that even when I've had pressure here and there, I've known that if this came to his attention, I think I would be absolved. And time has proved me right that when I had challenges in Kampala, where I was alleged not to have added up all votes of a certain magnitude, processes had to be put in place to establish circumstances transpired, and the truth prevailed. The court did its part. As a returning officer, I appeared in court, and to my surprise, I was asked no question. So my affidavit that I submitted was taken as was not challenged by anybody in the court of law. Now, of course, there are challenges within any democracy that there are some people who become overzealous and attempt to derail election practitioners. But the moment one knows, as I've gotten to know over time, that the head of state, who is the fountain of honor in the country, believes in free and fair election, one taking on an objective stand, one following the laws as they are, will definitely be sure that they would not be doing the wrong thing.
Thank you very much. I just want to bring you back to the long time back during the time of Socrates. Socrates didn't believe that democracy will work in the sense that maybe people who don't understand uh, the system uh, are not qualified to cast votes. What your view, especially on the African continent, of the democrats of this election, where sometimes some people who then goes to vote are people who are in rural areas who sometimes don't even understand the parliamentary system.
I think I do not see any better system or any better alternative to democracy to start with. So then maybe the issue is the forms it takes. But regarding democracy, I think in the foreseeable future, I do not see a better alternative to democracy, because democracy is about getting the majority of people's will prevailing. Of course, people can say that the majority are not necessarily right always, but at least the moment the majority are on one side, then it is worthwhile to understand them. Now, we have had phases in the democratization process. We had phases during the colonial times on the African continent, and during the colonial time, which lasted in some cases, centuries, elections were not heard about. In fact, the issues of elections started coming in when the struggles for independence started setting in, where were therefore legislative councils for most of the African countries. That's what they were referred to. And then after independence, there was dominance of one-party states, more or less, because party that emerged in elections after independence, a number of them opted to suppress the others. And then time came in when pressures came in, whether internal, there were also external pressures that were calling upon countries to conform to certain standards of democracy, which in this case was multipartism. Now, the case of Uganda is an interesting one. That for such decisions regarding the way of governance, the mode of governance, there was provision in our constitution for referenda. Now, in the year 2000, was in 1986 when the NRM came to power, there was a freeze on party activities. And as I said, there was the issue of individual merit, present yourself, present your qualities to the population, and then the population decides from among the many that would have presented them who would be best to represent them without an ideological bias. Then there was a referendum in the year 2000 where Ugandans were asked whether they should go multi-party, and they were emphatic in saying no. They do not want political parties. Then again, some pressures started coming in. Of course, some people felt there were, first of all, there had been political parties that had emerged before independence and now were in abeyance, and yet their leaders and their members felt they needed to organize under those parties. So again, pressure emerged. I put it as pressure from within and from other quarters, where there was a push towards having multi-party democracy because some people felt they were maybe being suffocated, and a referendum was held in 2005. That's the first general national electoral activity I got involved in as an election practitioner. And this time around, Ugandans voted to allow those who wanted to organize under different political settings to do so. And that came in. And but before that came in, Uganda had worked on had tried to prepare the population about multi-party democracy. And then because there were consultations that were held between, at that time they were referred to as political forces and government. And those consultations were chaired by the then National Political Commissar of the National Resistance Movement. And they kept meeting different political parties. Of course, they were not recognized as political parties then, they were political forces. Then they agreed on how they wanted parties to organize in Uganda. I was privy to some of those interactions, and I saw how the multi-party politics in Uganda was being configured. And then here we are in a multi-party setting. But Africa has a challenge that parties have tended to polarize the population. And yet they are seen as the standard for democracy in the world. Why is this? I think it's because not many of them are issue-based, or when they are championing their programs, they center more on attacking other parties, attacking individuals, rather than articulating the issues so that the population compares issues. Of course, then when such challenges as monetization of election sets in, then you get challenges. Of course, then when such challenges as corruption set in, that causes some setback towards democracy, because then people start seeing that there is no delivery on issues that the people who voted a particular setting to implement. When you get challenges like nepotism, those also they negate the benefits of democracy. So political parties, political actors need to focus on one, delivering what they promise, two, appropriating resources and using them correctly if people are to gain confidence in the elections. They need to see that, well, they are, what they voted for is being implemented, because ordinarily they should be voting based on issues, based on tangible promises, and then the political actors need to deliver what they promise. And where they fail, they need to sufficiently explain why they failed and why the population should have hope that they will be able to deliver on their promises. And political configurations really need to be issue-based, clear manifestos, clear agenda, clear development issues that they want to deliver, and that should be the focus. Otherwise, where you get issues like tribe setting in, when somebody gets to a campaign podium and starts attacking the character of another person or misleading others about the personality of another, then we miss the point, and then the benefits of multi-party democracy are, are eroded. So issue-based elections really should be the central thing. And then using homegrown system or hybrid systems, because really I can comfortably say that a number of parties have disappointed the population. They cause polarization. For as long as they do not focus on their manifestos, or for as long as they do not have clear ideologies, for as long as they are formed basing on sectarian tendencies, then they do not serve the purpose for which parties were intended by those who invented the party system of election.
Right. As we come to the close of this broadcast, we have just been almost 1.5 hours. Time flies. Um, if you were to meet the young Henry, uh, what one piece of advice you would give yourself when you first joined the Electoral Commission?
When I first joined the Electoral Commission 22 years ago, I was a very courageous young man. I remember one time when we were being oriented, and somebody stood out and told us that we seemed to be very ambitious young people, and that if we did not if we did not learn to keep quiet, we would lose our jobs faster than we got them. I remember standing up and asking the commissioners whether I had not made a mistake to join that organization. That courage. And I told them that I needed assurances because I had not left my other job, whether I should not retain the job that I was in. And it took a session of about an hour for the bosses to apologize and say, no, those statements of that officer are unfortunate. This is a worthwhile place to work in, and we encourage you to speak out, and you will not be victimized for speaking what what is constructive. So I would tell the older Makabayi to maintain that courage and one, to always be balanced in what I do. I would emphasize that to base decisions based on information and knowledge, and to minimize or to avoid emotions overriding or dictating my direction of thought. But above all, to always know that my work is governed by certain laws that ought to be abided by, and that what I do has an effect on others, and I should be very mindful about the effects of my actions.
Wow, wow, wow. I can't thank you enough for spending your time and coming and sharing with us your experience. And to those watching us, or those who will be watching this broadcast, this has been quite an extraordinary discussion, and he has got a lot of advice. And the one thing that stuck with me is he said, what the mistake of the electoral commission can be and have been fatal in other areas of our countries. And yeah, so thank you for joining us, and let's close the podcast.